Here it is time to begin. We're going to be in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 3. We need to wrap up a little bit from Daniel chapter 2 tonight, and then we'll be moving into Daniel chapter 3. If you have a copy of the workbook, if you don't, they are in the foyer. I'd highly recommend you get one of these copies. They are free. And there's a lot of information in them. So if you have a copy of your workbook, we're going to be on lesson number 5. So I hope everybody had a great day today. It's good to see you. We're wrapping up Wednesday night, and we're going to go all the way through the book of Daniel. So I hope this book has encouraged you with learning more about your Father in heaven, our God in heaven, and understanding who he is and his power. Let's go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, thank you, Lord. Thank you, Father, for another beautiful day you've given us. Thank you, Father, for this opportunity to come together tonight as your people. As we think about your great prophet Daniel, as we think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, help us, Father, to be courageous, to stand for what is right, to trust in you, no matter the circumstances. Be with those who are mourning the loss of loved ones, those who may be struggling in their faith. Help us, Father, to continue to stand on what is true. Thank you, Father, for your word that's been revealed to us. We pray, Father, that we will continue to walk by faith. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so last week we spent some time looking at Daniel chapter 2. So we've already made our way through Daniel chapter 1. We know that Daniel is in Babylon. We know that Daniel was taken about 605 BC. Babylon is now the world power. They have defeated the Assyrians. We know that King Nebuchadnezzar, he would rule for a span of about 40 years. He is king at this moment. He is a very powerful king. I described him last week as being somewhat crazy, and I think we see that again in chapter 3. He has a very short temper, and it's interesting with how he is going to respond to certain events. He's going to have this vision in chapter 2. And next week in chapter 4, we're going to learn some more things about Nebuchadnezzar as well. And so in Daniel chapter 1, we get this set up with Daniel, the other Hebrew boys who have been taken into exile in Babylon. If you remember Ezekiel, he's going to be taken in the second deportation. And these men, these young boys, at the end of Daniel chapter 1 and verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days, which the king has specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. So we already see God at work, and God is obviously a big theme of this book, seeing him rule over the world, seeing him work providentially, and even in the lives of individuals. He's going to show favor to Daniel and these Hebrew boys in chapter 1, and we see that he will continue to do this as well. Daniel and these young boys, Hebrew boys, they are young. And Daniel, his life is going to span to the 3rd year. I think the last vision we have in chapter 10, verses 1, 2, and 3, it is the 3rd year of King Cyrus. And so King Cyrus, he's the Medo-Persian king. And so think about this span that Daniel is going to live. Basically, all 70 years of this captivity. It's a long time. He's going to see a lot. So as you think about faith, as you think about growing in our faith, this is a great book for us to see that we can have faith, that we can continue to remain with our Father in heaven, and that's what God wants us to do. We talked about Hebrews chapter 11 last week as well, and how we find some references pointing back to the book of Daniel. So in Daniel chapter 2, we're not going to look through all the verses again because we spent most of the class last week looking at Daniel chapter 2. Hold on one second. There we are. So in Daniel chapter 2, we find here it is the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 1, it was the 1st year. And we see and we know that Daniel or Nebuchadnezzar, he had this dream. He's going to ask his officials, his men, those who claimed that they had this power to interpret dreams, to figure out what this dream was. And he adds an additional condition to this, right? Not only do I want you to interpret it, but what else did he want them to do or know? He wanted to know, yeah, you tell me what was the dream that I had. And so they say, well, how can anyone do that? Only gods can do that. And so he puts out a decree for all of these officials to be killed, the wise men in verse number 13 to be killed. And we see Daniel's faith in action here. As he gets news about this, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they're going to go before the king, Nebuchadnezzar, or Daniel's going to go before the king, and he's going to get some time. And what do these young men do immediately? They pray. Yes, somebody's going like this, right? Yeah, they go to God in prayer. God answers their prayer, and Daniel gives all credit to God. This is only by the power of God. This is only by the will of God. So we learn a great deal about the kind of heart that Daniel and these other young men had as well. They were very humble in nature. And so Daniel's going to stand before the king. And real quickly here, what's this dream all about? What does he see? What did Nebuchadnezzar, and I think that's interesting, number one, that this wicked king is going to have this dream. And I'll just go ahead and say it. So he sees this huge statue of gold, silver, of bronze, of iron, and mixed with clay as well. And that's where we really end it. And I just want to look at a couple of these verses here. So Daniel is interpreting this dream. And he's going to do this again later on in the book as well. And he tells Nebuchadnezzar, this is what you saw. And then at the end, verses 36 through 45, Daniel is going to give the interpretation. And so look at verse number 36. This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. I think that's important as well, that what he had was given to him by God. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to struggle throughout this book with pride. And he's going to attribute some things to God at the end of this chapter, where Daniel and his friends are going to be exalted. At the end of chapter 2, the king answered Daniel in verse 47, surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you've been able to reveal this mystery. Well, that sounds great. But then when we get into chapter 3, we see that Nebuchadnezzar has basically reverted back to who he was, and maybe he continued to be who he was. So we see here that Daniel is going to interpret this dream. In verse number 36, verse 37, verse number 30. Look at verse number 37. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. So this great image that he sees, that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, King Nebuchadnezzar, he is the head of gold. That's what's revealed to us here. Verse 39, after you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. So there's three kingdoms here. Nebuchadnezzar is king over Babylon. After him, another kingdom inferior to him is going to arise. Then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. And that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay. That will combine with one another in the seed of men. But they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. Then he says something very important as well. He says, in the days of those kings, talking about this fourth kingdom, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. So this gives us some more indication. The gold is the is Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon. And we see in the days of those kings of this fourth kingdom, going back to verse number 40, that God, the God of heaven, will set up a kingdom. So this is pointing to the days of the Messiah, to the days of Christ. This kingdom is going to be set up by God. It's going to be a kingdom which will never be destroyed. That kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So this gives us indication of when these things are going to take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So if you read your lesson and looked at some of the notes in the workbook, there's some explanation here, and I want to just talk about this here very briefly. We've looked at those verses here. So this first kingdom that Daniel was talking about, he said, you're the gold, you're the head of this great statue. So that's pointing to Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon. So remember one of the things that we see in the book of Daniel, that Daniel is going to cover a tremendous amount of time in history, beginning here with Babylon and pointing to the future in the latter days, going to the days of the Messiah. So we know that Daniel was taken around 605 BC, and Ezekiel was taken in that second remnant. Jerusalem fell, and the temple was destroyed in 586. I just put those because I think it's fascinating to see some of the big events that took place with Babylon being this world power. And Daniel also speaks about the fall of Babylon in the book, and this helps us as well to get a good understanding to see what these kingdoms are. When you go to chapter 5, and we'll be there in a couple of weeks, in chapter 5, here in chapter 5 we have Belshazzar, the king, and in verse number 28 you have this handwriting on the wall. And it says in verse 28, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. So we know that that's going to be this second kingdom that he speaks of. And the Medo-Persian Empire is going to be from about 539 BC to 331 BC. And so this represents the chest and the arms of silver. And when you think about the Medes and the Persians, think about King Cyrus. We read about him in our study last quarter. In the book of Isaiah, Isaiah actually mentioned Cyrus by name. Something very important as well, predictive prophecy. How can we trust that the Bible is true? One of the great pieces of evidence that we have is predictive prophecy. Cyrus being mentioned at least, 100 years before he was born, of what he was going to do. We read about Cyrus as well in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. We've already read that passage here in the class. But I do want to mention it again. I think it is very important in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. All of these events had been foretold by the prophets. They had been foretold by the prophets. You even go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4 with Moses. Moses spoke about what would happen to the people. In Deuteronomy chapter 27 and 28, he spoke about what would happen to the people if they did not listen to God. They would essentially be taken away. Instead of being the head, they would be the tail. And that's exactly what we find here with God's people in exile. So at the end of 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 22, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. I'm so impressed and I get excited thinking about this, the details that these writers have given us. The first year of Nebuchadnezzar, the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, the third year of Cyrus in Daniel chapter 10. So we have these time markers. We have these flags where we can just put this flag in the ground. We know exactly these moments or this time period here. So we read about Cyrus in 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 22. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord, by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. Notice that the emphasis keeps going back to the God of heaven, who is ultimately in control of kingdoms of men. It is always God. And he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So we get some additional details. We're not going to read Ezra chapter 1, but you can just go there. It's the next book after Chronicles. And Daniel talked about the Medes and the Persians back in Daniel chapter 5. And again as well, and we're not going to get too far ahead, but also in Daniel chapter 8. There's another vision that's going to be interpreted, and he mentions by name the Medes and the Persians. So there's not a lot of elaboration of this world empire, and I don't think that's really the big point. The big point is more of who is in control, and what Daniel has this power to be able to do, to interpret these dreams, and it's only because the God of heaven has given him this power. And so after the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, then you would have Greece ruling. And that represents the belly and thighs of bronze. Alexander the Great, many people know about him. And so Greece is also mentioned, I believe, in Daniel chapter 8. And so, yeah, the kingdom of Greece in Daniel chapter 8. So we'll get to that later on in the study. So I just want you to see here this dream that he has. It really is fascinating. And this interpretation that's being given is giving us this nice timeline. So we know that it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar as head with the gold. We know that the kingdom, whatever that kingdom is, that's last. That's not made by hands, but made by God. That's going to be eternal. There's something very unique and distinct and different about that. And that fits perfectly with what we read about in the New Testament with Jesus establishing his kingdom. And so we can put all of these pieces together to come to the proper conclusion. So the fourth kingdom that he speaks about in Daniel chapter 2 is pointing to Rome. And that becomes important as well, because in verse number 35, it says, the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue, so there's this stone that's going to strikes the statue, became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So you see this stone that becomes this great mountain, fills the whole earth. There's this growth that is going to be taking place. So when you go back to Daniel chapter 2, we get a sense of, while he doesn't mention these kingdoms by name in Daniel chapter 2, as we put the pieces together, as we read the rest of the book, as we think about what is given to us in this particular chapter here, we can come to the proper conclusion. And this is very important for us, especially as you get to verse 44. In the days of those kings, that needs to be connected with what he said in verse number 40, that there will be a fourth kingdom, talking about Rome, the Roman Empire, as strong as iron. And who it is that is going to establish this kingdom? It is the God of heaven. And so people may ask, well, what's the application for us? Well, we're part of this kingdom that's being foretold that Daniel is interpreting from this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And so that becomes important. So when you look in the New Testament, Jesus, before he died, he talked about in John 18 and verse 36, he said, my kingdom is not of this world. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus said, the time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. Why is this important? Because in verse 44 of Daniel chapter 2, Daniel said, in the days of those kings, a God of heaven will set up a kingdom. So when we go to the New Testament, we get to understand and see what this kingdom is referring to. This kingdom is referring to the kingdom that Christ would establish. In Mark chapter 9 and verse number 1, Jesus said, truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of heaven after it has come with power. So those at that time, there will be some who would see the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God come with power. In Acts chapter 1 and verse number 8, Jesus speaking to his apostles, he said, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. This goes back to our class on Sundays with the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, Jesus talking to his apostles, they would receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon them. You shall be witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and even to the remotest part of the earth. On the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, the apostles received this power. They were all together in one place. And we know that the kingdom would be established in Acts chapter 2. We see men and women being added to this kingdom. We know that Christ in Acts chapter 2, as Peter preached on the day of Pentecost, he is in heaven. He is ruling. He is at the right hand of God. So Christ is king. His kingdom has been established. We are citizens in his kingdom. And so all of this becomes important for us, and it's so fascinating to think about what is being said here in Daniel chapter 2, how it has application for us today. This dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, the way that God used Daniel to interpret this dream, it has great application for us today. We are part of this kingdom that's been established, this spiritual kingdom. And Colossians chapter 1 and verse number 13, Paul talked about to the saints here in Colossians 1 and verse number 13, for he has rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. And so that is what the kingdom is. That's what he's referring to back in Daniel chapter 2. So let's stop here. Any comments or questions? A lot of ground there, and we can dive into some other aspects of this later on as we go through the book. Any comments, questions? Okay, so what's the point? The point is, think about Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2. Think about the faith of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The emphasis right now is upon Daniel. At the end of chapter 1, Daniel and these young men, they had this power given to them by God. We see it in action, interpreting this dream. We see this history that's going to be taking place throughout centuries with Nebuchadnezzar, with Babylon. So think about the world powers that are mentioned. And who can know the future? No one can know the future except God. And so it keeps pointing us back to the great God of heaven. All right, so at the end of Daniel chapter 2, the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. So Babylon is about 200,000 people. Daniel and these other young men, they're being elevated at a very young age. Think about when you first started your job, maybe right out of college. You ever have some intimidation with that? That can be a little bit intimidating, right? I remember when I started with Pfizer and, learning how to talk to doctors, which was super intimidating. We had training classes in White Plains, New York, and they would record us. We'd have to have these role plays, and they would record us selling to the doctor, pretending to sell to the doctor. And I had one drug, and I told the doctor the guy who was playing the doctor, just add this on to the other medication. And they stopped the video. He said, what are you doing? You're going to kill the patient if you tell the doctor to do that. So there's a lot of intimidation when we first start off in the world, and it's so interesting thinking back to those days. My eyes were really opened even more with what happens in the world. When you start going to certain jobs and careers and businesses, you start to see a lot of things that maybe you were not aware of when you were in college or in high school. So every day there's a decision point. How am I going to respond? How am I going to act? Am I going to be different? So think about this pressure that Daniel and these young men had. They were already in exile. They are already outnumbered. They already have put their faith on the line, right? With Daniel going to the eunuch back in chapter 1 with the food, he made a decision. And that's something that we need to make sure that we really consider when it comes to our faith. When we make a decision and make the right decision, it will actually make our lives so much better. Because if we make the right decision, it will eliminate 1,000 other decisions. Daniel said, this is what I'm going to do. This is who I'm going to serve. So when other decisions came up that were contrary to where he was, it made it a lot easier for him to say, I'm not going to go down that path. There has to be this cutting away. And Daniel's priority was to serve God. So you see this faith in action. Now, what's interesting is who's not mentioned, I don't believe, in chapter 3, if you read it. Daniel. Yeah, so we have this book about Daniel. He's not mentioned in chapter 3. That's okay. We have this emphasis now upon Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So let's read it together. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold. So we don't have a time marker here in verse 1. There's one thing I saw that this may have been 18 years later. I'm not for sure. But however long it was, if it was a few weeks, a few months, a few years, someone asked me, did Nebuchadnezzar make this great image of gold because of the dream that he had? That's a great question. I have no idea. But what I do know is that he's going to make this image of gold. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits, so about 90 by 9. he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And so all of these people are going to assemble for this dedication in verse number 3 that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And at the end of verse 3 it says, "And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, 'To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn and a variety of all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up.'" So this was more than just something for the empire. There's worship involved. What's interesting, when you look at Daniel chapter 3, worship is mentioned 10 times. In verse 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, 18, and verse number 28. So obviously we have something that's being set up here. Another decision point's going to be made. And the 3 Hebrew boys are going to be in this story here, where they're going to have to make a big decision. Now, in verse number 6, "But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." So the stage is set here that those who bow down to it, they will keep their lives. And what we see in verse number 7, when the people heard the sound of the different instruments, the men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Any comments or questions about the first 7 verses here? Okay, so we're seeing here Nebuchadnezzar, and we're learning so much about him. I do think it's interesting the amount of information that we have about Nebuchadnezzar. And we get to see inside, how this king is thinking and what he's doing here. We know that he was very, obviously, authoritative, powerful, and so now he's forcing everyone to, you're going to listen to me. And if you don't listen to me, then here's what's going to happen. Now, there's nothing big there in the first 7 verses, but we're going to see in verses 8 through 18, the decision of these Hebrew boys. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. And this makes me think about Daniel chapter 6. We get to Daniel chapter 6, and it's interesting how some of these chapters are very parallel. Daniel chapter 2 is going to be kind of parallel to chapter 7. Chapter 3 is going to be parallel to chapter 6 to some degree. Remember Daniel in chapter 6. Daniel is going to continue to pray. He's going to keep his schedule of his daily prayers, praying 3 times a day. And people knew that he was going to pray. They could see him at his window, and people are going to tell the king at that time. And so this appears to be as a result of jealousy. Think about these young men who have risen so fast. And so for this reason at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar, the king, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree." So they're repeating everything that he's already said. But look at verse 11. "But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up." So we saw the faith of Daniel in action in chapter 1. We see his faith, I think, as well in chapter 2, standing before the king. Now we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Worship is the idea to prostrate oneself, to do homage, respect, renderings to God. So Nebuchadnezzar wants people to bow down to this golden image. And these 3 men, they say no. And now people see that. They see there's something different about these 3 individuals. I think that's a great point of application. Talking to Joshua on the way here, we were talking about the Sermon on the Mount because that's what they're going through in the back, Matthew chapter 5 and 6 and 7. We've already talked about the Sermon on the Mount. The idea of being salt and light. And we see here that these young men, there's something very different. So look at the response of Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 13, the Nebuchadnezzar in rage. So think back to chapter 1. Remember the eunuch said, man, if I do this, he's going to cut my head off. Then in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar wants all of the wise men to be killed. Now in chapter 3, we see this rage that the king has. Then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and anger gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Think about, it's like this interview moment. Have you ever had those moments? You ever get nervous when you have like an interview, like a job interview? Like, man, there's a lot at stake. Not compared to this. You'll get the job or you won't get the job, right? You'll get the pay raise or you won't get the pay raise. But think about this. All of us at some point in time are going to have our interview moment. You guys know what I'm talking about? It could be that moment at the lunch with your colleague and they start asking questions. That might be your interview. How are you going to respond when they start diving into, hey, what do you believe? I noticed da-da-da-da-da. Could you share some more information about your faith? When we start standing in front of people, that changes a lot. There can be a lot of pressure. So now imagine standing before the king, who you know is angry. He's in a rage, and look at what the king says. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, is it true? So looking at different books, just kind of preparing for this study, I like that statement. A lot of people have emphasized this. Is it true? Will people say that about us? Is it true? I can remember when I was with Pfizer, we would have these dinners, and they were awful. The food was good, but the situation was bad, right? That was free food, so that was always good. But, most of the people drank. And who's the one that's not drinking? I had made the decision to abstain from drinking alcohol. I had before, but I decided I was going to stop. And I can remember one of the guys, Chuck, he asked me one time, he said, hey, can I ask you a question? And he had a question about that. And so we have these kinds of moments, and it may not just be with alcohol. It can be with a lot of different things. It can be with our marriages. It can be with our beliefs about certain things that are taking place in the world. The point is, these are some moments where we have to decide, and hopefully the decision has already been made way before we ever have this interview moment. This is who I am. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew who they were. Yeah, their names were changed, but that had not changed their faith in the true and living God. Their geographical location had changed, but that had not changed who they were and the fact that they were still going to serve the true and living God. So college students, young married couples, older individuals, this is something very important for us. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? People put that pressure on us. You don't really believe that, do you? Well, how are you going to tell me what I believe or don't believe? If I tell you this is what I believe, then this is what I believe. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Man, talk about a person filled with pride. Now, if you're ready, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you another chance. If you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn and the flute and these other instruments, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. That's what happened. That's what a lot of people want. What the world wants today is for Christians just to kind of cave when it comes to our beliefs. We'll give you another shot. You want to fit in, right? You don't want to be the only three. I mean, imagine this, if this was how it looked, where you had this huge gathering, and there's three guys just standing up. Awkward. We have a hard time saying something in Bible class, much less standing up where everyone is going to see us. But this is what's taking place here. So if you bow down, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Well, what had Nebuchadnezzar forgotten? I don't know. Maybe this interpretation that Daniel gave, talking about the God of heaven who gave him this power. So this is so true for us. You know, the intimidation factor. And I love Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter." Don't you just love that? That's courage. We don't need to answer you. Can you guys think of some other times in the scriptures where people just didn't really give an answer? Now, they're going to give some additional details, but I like how they just start off saying, look, we don't have to give you an answer. That's showing great confidence. I think about Jesus in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse number 7. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse number 22 and 23. I'll just read that here real quickly. I was just thinking about this with how they responded. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 22 and 23. Who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. So they said, look, we don't have to give you an answer. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. So again, their faith and their confidence, and that's part of our theme for this quarter, Christ our King, dealing with trust. That's what this faith looks like, this faith in action. Now we know what is true about God, if it be so, or if our God decides to do this, whom we serve. We don't serve your gods, but we know that our God is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. These are the same young men who had prayed back in chapter 2 with Daniel before he went before the king. These are the same young men who also ate the same kind of food that Daniel did back in chapter 1. Now notice verse number 18. This is very important for us as we think about our faith and confidence and how we view God. But even if he does not, so they didn't know exactly how this was going to turn out. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king. That's something for us to really consider. God is able. We've seen this time and time again. And God will always do what is right. God will always do according to his will. So they said, look, but even if he does not, and that's very similar, when you think about just kind of thinking about suffering. Why isn't God doing anything? Why isn't he changing this? Well, we know that he has the ability. But even if he doesn't, and that's the kind of faith that we need to have as well, even if he doesn't, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Clear, concise, concrete faith. This is who we are. This is what we believe, and we're not going to budge. So, comments or questions with those verses there? Think about how this will apply to you. Maybe it's your interview moment. Maybe it's that moment with your family. Maybe in your own house. Maybe at work, with your friends, whatever the situation may be. Make a decision. And we've already made the decision, haven't we? When we confess that we believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, pledging our allegiance to him, we've already made this decision. So it should naturally help us to make other decisions that come our way that much easier. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So that paints this picture of how hot it really was. But these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace, the blazing fire, still tied up. Everybody can see this. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste, and he said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." And I loved what someone said in a commentary. God didn't deliver them from the fire, but in the fire. So they went into the furnace. God didn't deliver them from the fire, but he delivered them while in the fire. And think about the phrase, and I've done some sermons on this, I am with you. I am with you. Gideon needed to hear that. Paul needed to hear that. The apostles needed to hear that. We need to hear that as well. That our Father in heaven is with us even during the fire, even during the storms. And so the king is in shock because he said, look, in verse 25, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Some believe that this may be the pre-incarnate Christ, or it could just be some kind of angelic, obviously spiritual being. We go back to Job chapter 1. The sons of God presented themselves before God in Job chapter 1, and that's what it seems to be pointing to here. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace, a blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God. Oh, his tune has changed. Now things are a little bit different with Nebuchadnezzar. And come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. Any comments with that? Look at verse number 27. All the people who were there, all the officials who were there, they saw this. And this is important too. Let me read this too. That the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. That's always like my worst fear, right? A big breakfast before Sunday worship, and you come to the building smelling like bacon, right? But they didn't have any smell on them, right? And so how is that possible? Only because of God. That is the power of God. And we see God working providentially through nations, through kings, and also even through individuals here. So God delivered them, their faith, and that's what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 11, individuals by faith, verse 33 and 34, conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, going to Daniel chapter 6, quenched the power of fire. So think about this kind of faith. Now think about your fire, your storm, whatever it may be. This, brothers and sisters, is how we need to respond. God is with us through it all. And we know what he is able to do, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, going back to verse 17 and 18, but even if he does not, we remain with him. We cannot allow circumstances to dictate whether or not we're going to remain with God. If he doesn't do this, we give him terms, right? If he doesn't do this, then I'm not going to follow him anymore. Well, then there's something amiss. There's something wrong with our faith and with understanding of who God is and how we view him. So think about this mindset for yourself and your circumstances. Maybe you don't have anything big going on, but this is what we need to help our children to see as well. Even if he doesn't, even if things don't necessarily change the way that we want them to change, we are not going to bow down. Don't bow down to the influences of the world. Don't bow down to the teachings of the world. And don't bow down to even some of the things we think ourselves, right? Let's go back to the scriptures and let's consider what God has to say. We trust him in the good days. We trust him in the challenging days. And we know that he will deliver us. Thank you for your attention. We'll stop here. Lesson number 6 next week, and that will be in Daniel chapter 4. Thank you very much.